Wobei ich das auch gern zweisprachig machen kann, zunächst in Deutsch nach dem Vorbild der jungen Damen und danach in Englisch. Und es ist mir eine ganz besondere Freude, jetzt nochmal 30 Sekunden zu sprechen, bis die Kameras wieder so weit sind und ich das... Dann wird es noch kürzer. Dann ist es mir eine umso größere Freude, Jacob Appelbaum ankündigen zu dürfen. Einen guten Freund, der ja, seine bürgerlichen Rechte in Anspruch genommen hat und dafür seither in einer bizarren Geschichte gegen die Bürokratie lebt. Und ich denke, auch darüber wird sich ein bisschen sein Vortrag richten. So, it's my special honor to introduce Jacob Appelbaum, a courageous individual who exercised his constitutional rights and ever since fights with the bureaucracy, and I think that's something that he's going to address. Give him a warm welcome, the floor is yours.
Hi. So I won't try to say anything in German tonight because I've only been here for a couple of days and my German is still awful. But I guess, you know, tonight I was a little surprised to be invited here. I didn't think anyone even knew that I was in Germany. So thanks a lot for having me. I really... You know, that's surveillance. Yeah, for sure. So I'm not sure if this is true. I wonder if someone could tell me, but I heard that Germany just declined to give Edward Snowden political asylum. Is that correct? Yes. Why are you not rioting in the streets? Seriously. I mean, that's unfucking believable. I'm pretty horrified. I was actually hoping, when I was coming here, I was hoping to be able to encourage you to actually try to get him political asylum here in Germany. Because if not Germany, where? Germany is the... I think that it's partially due to historical stuff that we can say that Germany is the most spied upon nation in Europe by the NSA. It's pretty awful, actually, how much spying is taking place. But the interesting notion for me is to see that you have a relatively functional democracy. I say relatively functional because when I consider my own country, the United States, it doesn't feel very functional. Whereas, you know, when I talk to regular Germans about how they vote and how they're able to participate in their democracy, I'm really impressed by how it seems like they're able to do that. And the results are not necessarily what people would like. And so that's basically the same everywhere in the world. But the fact that you have so much ability to participate and still not succeed in what you want is really impressive to me. And at the same time, there is a lot of success. I mean, Germany is a pretty fantastic place in a lot of ways, or the people of Germany that I meet, they tell me about what they'd like to build and how on a community level, on a city level, how they're building that, and they really do have some successes in that. So I was totally blown away to hear that Germany did not actually give him political asylum here. And it actually makes sense, though. And the reason is because you are colonized, right? And that's the sad truth of the matter. And it has been this way, as Andreas has said, for more than 50 years. And this is really depressing, right? Because on the one hand, if we want to say that we have a sovereign nation and that the policies that people choose, that they matter, and that there is privacy, and that the laws that protect your privacy, that they matter, you need to have a sovereign nation for that. And when Snowden is not allowed to have political asylum here, and when we see that what he has revealed is on the front cover of Der Spiegel, you guys see this week? I know a lot of you probably don't read Der Spiegel, but I helped a bit with that article, which is also why I'm in Germany. And for me, what I see is that Germany is really ridiculously spied upon, and many of your leaders are aware of this. And there's a sort of conflict of interest that exists, which is the conflict of interest in which they also wish to spy on you at their discretion. And as a result, everyone must be left vulnerable. Even though the job of the state, generally speaking, is to keep people secure. Like, if there was tainted food, they're supposed to get rid of this tainted food and give you a right of private action or public action in which to take so that you can, if you're sick, have care. If you have the ability, for example, to find out how you were, ingesting this tainted food, to be able to have, some kind of redress, right? And these things exist. What else would you have a liberal democracy for if not to organize in this way? So if those things didn't exist, you would probably not consider it much of a liberal democracy at all, I suppose. So it's fascinating to me because the NSA really does have the ability to spy on everything in Germany. And it's total. And in the near future, it will become clear why I think this, but from what you've seen already in Der Spiegel, I think it should be quite clear that this is the case. So for him to not be granted political asylum to me is just like horrific. And it suggests that the US has not only total surveillance, but basically complete control. And that to me is like, I don't know. It doesn't make me actually feel a lot better to be here. Let's say. I mean, a little better, at least, you know, in the sort of like, you can pretend things are great when they're not. So the first part is totally pointless now because the decision has been made. Unless you know people that can change this decision, then please, by all means, work as hard as possible to get Snowden here. What he will tell you about Germany and what he will tell you about American spying in Germany and other spying will blow your fucking mind. It's not important why I'm saying this, but what I am saying is that it is quite clear to me that the spying that is taking place here is unbelievably bad. And compared to the rest of Europe especially, right? What we've learned about the UK with Tempora. Have you heard of this program, all of you? Has anyone not heard of this program? So I can just quickly recap. Great, 2 people, 3, 4, all right. The Tempora intergalactic hacking community, we would like to welcome you. So the Tempora program is not, you know, fried battered fish and vegetables at a Japanese restaurant, but it is in fact total surveillance of the internet and telephone systems in the UK. It's a ring buffer, essentially. And so what do I mean by this? I mean, if you send a packet into the United Kingdom or to another country through the United Kingdom, I think the buffer is about 3 full days of data. This is not metadata, data. You send a packet into the UK, it sits in a buffer for 3 days. Every phone call, every text message, every video you watch, everything. Who here uses the internet? Who here, right? Whoever uses a service that goes through the United States? That's what we're talking about. So if we think of the Tempora program as one example, we see from the Der Spiegel articles that have just come out this week, we know that there are some other examples as well of other places that are doing this kind of spying. So maybe it's not just a matter of sending your packets through the United Kingdom. I mean, it is also the case that the United Kingdom is basically any internet cable going in and out of that country is just totally toxic. It's completely radioactive in this sense for privacy. And any place that has this kind of surveillance, there is a thing that is called tasking. What tasking is another nice way of saying targeting, right? So what this means is that you have this unique fingerprint. Everyone has it. It's unfortunate because we create our own. And there are learning algorithms in which a person has a set of identifiers that they're associated with, and they have a set of behaviors that they regularly do, like looking at a web page, doing this thing, posting this way, signing their emails in this way. And there exists heuristics for determining when people have switched devices and when they have changed from, say, one Android phone to an iPhone, or when the iPhone is being used by a person for a while and then they sell it to someone else. The behavior of the device actually changes. But all of the identifiers become linked with a sort of Stasi-like profile, right? And this is what is necessary for tasking or targeting someone. And this kind of tasking and targeting is taking place here in Germany. And this is a pretty terrifying thing because it means that all the devices you touch and all the computers that you use and all the accounts that you have, each of those things adds to this unique fingerprint. And now when you say use Tor, which is extremely important in the resistance that we have right now, and I say that as a paid employee of the Tor project, but if I didn't work on Tor as a paid employee of the Tor project, I would still feel that way knowing what I know. But if you are using something like Tor, you may be able to buy yourself some time, right? That's what we should consider and try to think about crypto products in this way. You buy yourself time. There is no perfection, right? There's only time. So when it is that you are able to, let's say, mask your fingerprint for a moment, you're able to do things. Banksy actually had a great joke about this, the graffiti artist in the United Kingdom. He said, in the future, everyone will be anonymous for 15 minutes. He was an optimist. So it's looking, I think it's actually looking a lot worse than that, which is to say that essentially this unique fingerprint that we have, we betray ourselves. The social circles that we have, when we call these regular people, we actually switch it up. So for example, these drone strikes that have been happening in Yemen and Pakistan, and actually on the border of Turkey, like all kinds of pretty awful flying robots that murder people. You guys are familiar with this? There's a lot more coverage about drone strikes in the German media than there is in the American media, sadly. But essentially, these things happen because of things like your IMEI, your individual unique serial number on your telephone, the IMSI, that's the SIM card data, you know, the MAC address on laptops, the actual behavioral patterns of people, who they call, what social circles they're a part of. This is part of how people use the data. So the data that's being tasked about someone here, let's say me, just hypothetically, here in Germany, let's say someone was tasking that, they would be able to use that data to see where in the world I popped up. So if I take my laptop and I move to another country and I connected to an email server and I logged in and I read my email, it's possible for someone to know that I've moved from country to country because there is a sensor network that wraps the planet, right? All of the radio frequency emissions of the planet are being intercepted by the NSA with very few exceptions. And where they don't actually have sensors, that is where they haven't been able to put in an FBI interception device, they break into machines. So just to like recap that, because I think I just said a whole lot of stuff really quickly, which is maybe a little difficult to believe, but you'll see soon enough. When the FBI or the NSA or the CIA or whoever is doing these kinds of interception systems, when they cannot put an interception device or a so-called lawful interception device, you know this, when people talk about telephone wiretapping, they mean spying. And when they talk about being able to do deep packet inspection, they also mean spying. So when they can't put in a spying device, they break into computers. And they turn each of those devices into a spying device. Right? And that's happening all across the world, but it's also happening in Germany. It's happening in Europe. Some of these devices, when they are compromised, it makes sense that they would be compromised because your leaders, for example, also believe, they have this thing, I like to call it the rule of law fallacy. And the reason I call it the rule of law fallacy is it's this belief that because there is a law, some people might break it and then you catch them. But the basic idea is that law actually regulates behavior, especially because in a disciplined society, you can punish someone for breaking the rules, right? Makes sense? The only problem is that, you know, the Chinese in the United States, for example, they don't give one whit about German law, and there is no punishment for them. So in a disciplined society, they have no incentives, actually, for changing their behavior, especially if they don't get caught. And especially for secret devices that no one talks about, where there's no public debate, where you're not actually allowed to even know these devices exist. You see where I'm going with this. So these devices, they are fundamentally in core parts of the internet. And because they fundamentally, their job is to do this job that someone wishes they were doing, getting it to do the same thing but for someone else is fundamentally the goal of a number of intelligence agencies. And it's quite a scary thing, actually, to consider this fact. So in the rule of law fallacy, the idea is that they will only make sure that someone will task and intercept on Electra's phone, for example, when a legitimate court, whatever that means, issues, you know, a court order saying wiretap her, tell me her location, right? And if you guys have seen the visualization of Malte Spitz, his 6 months of cell phone records that he sued, I think it was Telecom for, that's the sort of level of information and detail that it becomes possible to gather about Electra with that. Well, so the thing is, though, in the rule of law fallacy, the notion is that the only people that can do that are a German court. But that's just not true. Policy does not actually limit what is possible. What limits what's possible is mathematics, cryptography usually, secure architectures. And because the conflict exists where the people who are supposed to deploy this infrastructure also wish to spy on you, they never deploy infrastructure that's secure enough to actually keep you secure. So this isn't about privacy for activists or something like that. It's about privacy for everyone. And because they want to be able to spy on some activists, all of you are fucked. Really, that's the fundamental thing. And so from an economics perspective, it's not being talked about where we say that there is an economic trade-off for a German business person, for example, right? When a German business person goes to Dubai, for example, so that the Germans can spy on him or her or other as they wish, then so can the people in Dubai, because the system is fundamentally insecure. And so rather than belabor the point, what I mean to say is that we must bring law and technology in line. So we have to give up the secrecy component. I want to say that we should give up wiretapping entirely, but I recognize that this is a really hard thing because junkies have like a real attachment to the things that give them a rush. And spies, they like to spy on you. So getting rid of that entirely is probably too lofty a goal. But if everyone had end-to-end encrypted off-the-record messaging conversations instead of barebacking with the internet when they chat, it would be safer. You would be able to detect when someone does a man-in-the-middle attack, but it won't fundamentally stop that someone can do a man-in-the-middle attack. So we have to move incrementally from a world in which interception is possible and probably 100% of the time you'll succeed, or like 99% of the time you'll succeed without having to break crypto, to a world in which there's lots of crypto, but you have to actively interfere, and if someone is technologically inclined, they may be able to detect it. This is a hard jump, but if we don't make that jump, I think that we do a great disservice. And it's one of the ways that we can have sovereign groups again, not necessarily nations, but probably actually sovereign nations as well. Because one might suggest that when you can wiretap a whole country, its political elite doesn't get to decide who gets political asylum, because you have information on all of them. You can blackmail all of them. You can do whatever you want. You have total control, right? This is the Foucault, idea, essentially, the Foucauldian ideal that surveillance is control. And so I think it will become clear in a very short amount of time how bad it is. But when Andreas suggested that this is what has always been, I would like to suggest two things that are different. The first is that, well, there has often been spying throughout the entire planet, throughout all of human history. It has never really been at countrywide scale with everybody knowing that it's happening. Really though, when AIMSys sells countrywide intercept solutions, for example, to Libya, for Gaddafi to be able to spy on a whole country, that had never happened before in the history of Libya. So the economics of this are totally thrown off. Where previously, it was possible for Gaddafi's henchmen to be able to spy on a few people, he couldn't really actually do searches on 100% of the communications of the country. Well, there exists a country actually in Europe, I think it's in Spain, Agitno, I think is the name of the company, and they do voice print analysis, and I've been told by some reputable folks, let's say unrelated to other things I've been talking about, just to be clear, that they do 100% voice print analysis on every phone call in Spain to identify people. Why do you identify them? You identify them to eradicate them, right? That's what this is about. It's about control, and in some cases, for example, with some of the Basque separatists, this is how they identified the Basque separatists, apparently. We should find evidence of this to be able to back it up. I've heard it from a reputable source, but as an example, in theory, this is legitimate counterterrorism, anti-terrorism kinds of stuff, but the trade-off there is fascinating, which is that imagine there's like a stalker or a rapist that works at this voice print place. We would never know if they abuse their position of power because we hardly even acknowledge that they have such a position of power. And certainly I don't remember anyone in Spain voting on 100% voice print analysis. So it's not democratic. So if there is no consent, it's probably the case that it isn't actually very democratic at all. And so one would argue that probably it's not very legitimate at all. So looking at these kinds of systems that exist, understanding the way that tasking and targeting works, if you are tasked and targeted, you're fucked. It's basically the best way to put it. And I don't mean to let my depression spill out all over your audience and everybody here, but realistically, like, you just can't win, right? Like, you can win a little bit every now and then, but you can't really win forever, right? Because when you can break into all the infrastructure and start to reposition and to spy, it's a lot easier to break into a general purpose user's computer when they run a web browser or they use, Adobe malware like Flash and things like that. Right? Free software is a little bit better, but software is about as good as it actually realistically is on an individual basis. And some free software is really awful, actually, and some is really good. Just like some proprietary software may be all right and may be terrible. Good luck figuring out which it is. But the thing is that Germany could, for example, enact some very strong legislation that requires strong cryptography. Things where when, in theory, a judge is supposed to only be the person that can say if her phone is tapped. It may be the case that that's that that's actually something you can enforce, so that the only people that can tap it are the German officials, and the trade-off is that she gets to know her phone is being tapped. I think that this is a reasonable balance, because the people who don't have privacy now are regular people, right? The criminals, they have privacy. Criminals gets privacy, and we don't. I'm not sure that I'm happy about that, but I appreciate the applauding about that for some, and maybe I don't know, but you know, really regular people don't have privacy, and retroactively so, right? I mean, the goal, William Binney, who is an NSA whistleblower, he specifically talked about this. His goal when building the surveillance systems that we now understand are being unveiled, his goal was to track 7 billion people on the planet, or more, 8 billion people, 10 billion people, to build a social graph of the entire human race was his goal. Okay, when Deutsche Homag had punch card machines in France and Holland and Germany and around Europe during the Nazi occupation, sorry to bring up the Holocaust, gotta do it. The ability, really I am, sorry, I really am, really. But it's not okay, it's terrible. I wish I could give a better example, but you know, this is just how I was raised. Fear of the Holocaust. So, really, and so, oh man, what a fucking nightmare. Anyway, so, right? The point is that when they had fucking punch card machines, they were able to eradicate 70% of the Dutch Jewry. And in France, where the punch card machines were actually used by a saboteur, and this saboteur helped organize the French resistance, they got 30% of the Jewry of France. The difference was one fucking person. In Holland, one Nazi, who isn't even a German, he was a Dutchman. And he was such a radical racist statistician, which is a very strange story, by the way, that he was able to basically single-handedly push his politics over the world for eradication. That punch card machine is like a fucking joke compared to the surveillance machines that we have now. So fundamentally, the way that I think that we can avoid that situation in the future, if it is possible to avoid it still, is to change it so that Germany is actually a sovereign nation, so that everyone is a sovereign nation in this regard, by making end-to-end crypto a reality, by making telecommunication links encrypted, but actually we can also personally do something about this. So I grew up in San Francisco during the HIV scare and the AIDS epidemic in the 80s and in the 90s. And you know, a lot of people don't like this analogy, so if you don't like it, I'm sorry in advance, but it's the best one I've got. I actually have a better one, but I'm going to stick with this one now that I think of it. So I've already committed. But you know, basically, watching a lot of people in that situation, there were a couple of archetypes. One of the archetypes was the arrogant white guy. You know this guy. Maybe you've even been this guy. I don't know. But this guy exists. And in the 80s, what he said was there was no such thing as HIV. It's a gay disease. It's just the GRID, if some of you know that, the gay-related immune deficiency syndrome. And, you know, they don't need to protect themselves. They don't need to care about other people. They don't need to get tested, etc. So most of those guys, they fucking died, right? And the people who took care and realized they were not exempt from the ramifications of an epidemic that they hardly understood, those people, they had a survival advantage. And so many people, including gay men that I knew, I grew up near a hair salon, and working in a hair salon even, actually, and you know, these guys, some of them also died, and it was really tragic. I mean, being a little kid and seeing this happen around you all the time, it really impacts you. But what really also impacted me was that an individual could choose to protect themselves, and often it was those people that lived. It was those people that survived. And the transitive risk with sex is a great example of a transitive risk we see with society, which is that when someone wants to map your social graph as a method of control, as a method of surveilling you for control, when you can protect your social graph and when you can protect the contents of your messages, and when you refuse to use devices like Skype, for example, when you refuse to use things that are part of the PRISM program, you're actually doing exactly that. You are protecting yourself from this transitive risk that exists. And so using cryptography is like having safe sex. And when you tell people that I don't want to have unprotected communications, you are protecting yourself. And in particular, you're protecting yourself, but you're also saying, respect me. Don't have unprotected communication with me. I don't know what you're going to say. I don't know how in 50 years the Americans are going to view this. I don't know how the German government will view it in 10 years. I don't know if right now someone else will do it. To give you an example, I just turned 30, and now that I'm halfway to death, just kidding. You can't be halfway at 98%, but whatever happens, it was murder. So, terrible. Anyway, I think it's important to understand this, right? I'm in Berlin right now because I had the really fucking awful, unfortunate mistake of, for my whole life, dreaming to go to Hawaii, to go swimming with manta rays and dolphins and like all this other like, you know, unicorns and rainbows and all that stuff, right? We didn't find any unicorns and rainbows. Well, we actually found 2 rainbows, but no unicorns. And so I was in Hawaii for my 30th birthday in April, and 20 of my friends came. It was like the most incredible thing I had ever experienced. Like, if you want to feel loved, have 20 people fly for a really fucking long time to an island in the middle of an ocean, right? And to fly you there as a gift for your birthday. So I felt really loved, and I felt like this is incredible. What a fantastic thing, and what great friends. And I'm so lucky to have friends like this in my life. The problem with data retention is it tells a story about you which is not necessarily true, and I've said this many times, but it's made up of facts, individual facts which may be correct, but the story that they tell depends on who's telling the story. So the narrator of a story, like let's say an analyst looking at your data trail because of a grand jury, let's say related to WikiLeaks, or other things, let's say related to the largest national security leak in human history. Well, can you imagine what that analyst is thinking now that I had the misfortune of finally living this childhood dream, only to have 2 months later, a guy from Hawaii being stationed in Hawaii leaking these documents? So here's a great threat, which is that I don't actually trust that my country is a safe enough place that I should wait around and see if justice still exists. So I came to Berlin because I thought it would be a much better place to write about some of the things that are taking place now, to work with people that are interested in understanding the surveillance, because for a decade I've worked on these issues. And finally, we have the information, as you've seen in Der Spiegel recently, and as you've seen in The Guardian. Finally, we have this information, and it's possible for us to really start to understand the way the world is really working, and the way that these systems are really watching us. But with data retention, it might tell a different story for an analyst. Can you imagine that, what that story might be? Because I can imagine it. Because several years ago, I had the misfortune also of flying to another place from a different island, which is that I was in Iceland with a fellow by the name of Julian. And I happened to be on my way to Boston on the way home. And I stopped in Boston for a number of days. And I've never talked about this in public, but I think I'm fucked enough now that it really can't make it any worse. And if it does, it's still worth telling. So I just happened to be there to visit a friend of mine. And then I went home. And it was no big deal. But think about what an analyst would think of this, right? So you've got these like spook analysts, they look at the data trail you leave behind. Well, what happened is during the WikiLeaks grand jury, the friend that I went to visit in Boston, she was interrogated about me. And the story that they told, which is not true, was that Manning, again, not true, had handed me everything, which is not true. I gotta keep saying that every other word, right? Think about that, what that is. And the reason that out of 6 million other people in this area that they would say that is because there is a data trail where I used a credit card, where I used a telephone, whatever the case might be, right? I had flown through this place. So my friend was interrogated about this theory, which is just a theory. And it turns out when Manning, during his military trial started, he actually talked about what happened, how he actually leaked documents to WikiLeaks, and you'll note he did not mention me at all. But the analysts in the Department of Justice, they told a totally different story, because with all the data there, you can tell whatever story you'd like. This is a really incredibly dangerous thing. So I decided, I'll just spend some time in Europe. I've been through this once before with the Manning issue. I can't even imagine what these analysts are thinking now. And the only thing worse than I can imagine than diplomats and army people and military people is spies. Shit, what bad luck. And so, fascinatingly, I feel like I can serve as a warning to all of you on a whole bunch of levels, And I hope that you take this warning. And one of them is that you don't want my present. You don't want it. You want a different future, but my present is all of your futures. When Snowden doesn't get asylum here, that's absolutely the case. When Germany doesn't make that commitment, and when we individually allow for unsafe communications, that's the future we're building. And it's a very scary one. And having talked with a number of Ostis about what it was like to live under the Stasi, one of my favorite conversations was about how a Stasi person said, and not an Osti that lived under the Stasi, but an actual Osti that was a Stasi person, said that they wish that they had access to this machine, there might still be a GDR. I don't really have strong feelings about that because I didn't experience it, but some of my other friends that were Ostis, I asked them what they thought about this, and they were like so red and angry in the face that I guess I understood that they didn't like it. And my thought is that that's kind of the world we're living in, or we're on the way to that potentially. And in some ways, it's the same as it's always been. But in other ways, it's different. The system that's being built in Bluffdale, Utah right now is a massive data repository. Remember that name. That is the name that you will want to remember about that. The MDR system that is being built there is designed to store the communications, the metadata, information about task targets. It's designed to do that for over 100 years. The whole lifetime, a person's lifetime. It will enable generational crime. So for example, when we talk about internet freedom, we have to actually realize what we're really talking about is just freedom, just liberty. It's not actually about technology. Technology, it starts with fire and it moves up to, free software. But we must think about this in a different light. It's not just about technology, it's about what happens with the technology. And so these MDRs, they're really scary. Do any of you know about the drone strikes that happened in Yemen with a man by the name of Anwar al-Awlaki? Some of you? Has anyone not heard about this? Okay. He was an asshole on YouTube who I think in my lifetime is the first person to ever be killed by a flying robot for free speech issues. And President Obama, he went for his national address, and he talked about how this person was a terrible, terrible guy, and he really deserved to get murdered extrajudicially, assassinated. And this guy basically, he never had a trial. He didn't have a chance to say that the evidence was wrong. And his father actually tried to bring an injunction. And the judge threw out the injunction and said, sorry, you don't have standing. That is to say, you're not the guy being targeted. It's just your son. You can't do this. And the president can actually very narrowly, in certain circumstances, order your son to be killed by a flying robot or just to be assassinated in general. And there is nothing you can do. And he dismissed the case. And a couple of weeks later, he was killed by a flying robot. Right? We call those drones. How do you suppose that they found the guy? With surveillance. That's how they found the guy. So surveillance is literally being used in service of political assassinations in my country, but not just in my country, in countries all around the world. What makes this story really fucked up, because that's actually not the end, that's halfway through. What makes it really fucked up is that the president then later went on to talk about this being the world's greatest thing, about how great it was to get rid of assholes like this guy. And he sounded like an Islamofascist, homophobic motherfucker, right? Like, he's no friend of mine, right? Given the choice, I'm sure he would love to, do terrible things to me or for me to cease to exist. Fuck him. But what happened next is that his 16-year-old son was also in Yemen 2 weeks later at a barbecue, I believe, at his grandparents' house. So this kid is born in America, and I actually don't think that matters, but I just want to drive it home if there are any Americans in the audience that still believe that there's a thing called American exceptionalism or that it was ever a very good idea to begin with. This 16-year-old kid was killed by a fucking drone too. He didn't post anything hateful on YouTube. He was killed by a fucking flying robot. It's unbelievable. And the White House talked about how this was a good thing and that he was a terrorist and so on. And a couple of weeks later, they finally said, oh, sorry, he wasn't a terrorist, our mistake. So a 16-year-old American kid in Yemen, mourning the death of his father at his grandparents' barbecue, I think is how you could frame it, killed by a flying robot. And later, my president goes on television, and I say my, because I voted for him twice, stupidly, and he justifies the killing of the father and does not even mention the killing of the son. So this is generational crime. And their crime were being, I mean, I guess you could say that their crime was basically that they were Muslims in Yemen that posted on YouTube. And if you've ever gone to YouTube and looked at the comments, you know there are some pretty awful people in the world. But that shouldn't be a reason to kill people, obviously. But the point of this story is not to tell you about some guys that should not have been killed by my country, because there are so many of those people, and so many innocent people, and I say innocent as in they didn't even mean to target them, but they still killed them, right? Ridiculous. The ratio is 10 to 1. When a manned airplane kills people, they kill far fewer so-called collateral damage civilian casualty types than when a drone does it. So that means they target one person with the drone and they kill 11, basically, 10 or 11 people. And they may not even get, this is the worst part, the person they were trying to get. So this is a huge change. So it's not just that drones are bad, it's actually that they're 10 times worse, right? And this ties to surveillance, in that surveillance is how these people are targeted. And when you have 100,000 American soldiers on German soil, and you do not really get to choose about who gets asylum, necessarily, which seems to be the case, it becomes difficult for me to imagine that it's possible to also say that you're a sovereign nation, and it becomes possible, I think, for me to question whether or not you accept this. And the reason I wanted to come here and talk about these things tonight was that I was hoping that each and every one of you would see the connection between the surveillance of which you are a subject. You would see the imperialist connection, and you would see the connection to the murders that are taking place and the political assassinations, and say that this is enough. It shouldn't happen. We should stop it. And we should throw our bodies onto the gears to stop the machine if necessary. And if that sounds totally fucking crazy to you, what I would suggest is, if you think you are exempt right now, I think you will find that you are not in the future. And it is exactly this fallacy that we must get past. We must recognize that our soul salvation, if we were to quote Alexander Solzhenitsyn, it lies in us caring about each other, in making everybody's business our business. And I think that this is true and very important, because I cannot have a free country when you support my tyrannical regime abroad. And I need your help to be able to feel safe to return home. I need to be able to ask for that solidarity. And without that, I don't think that that will be true for a long time. Although it could be wrong and everything could be fine in the very near future. I somehow really doubt that, but it's possible. But these things that are taking place, they happen in your name, and just as they happen in my name. The main difference, though, is it seems that whatever say you think you have, it is subservient to the things that other people say that they want you to do and your country to do. And this, to me, is terrifying. And it's very difficult to work for a just world without actually being able to consent to these things. So it's a little bit weird to follow up a talk about Tor and not talk about Tor, and instead to talk about surveillance and how it connects to political assassinations. But that's really the deal, right? And in the very near future, there'll be a series of articles that will explain a lot more of these things. And we have to very carefully understand that we are all impacted by this. If you think you have nothing to hide, remember the story I told you about Hawaii. I have nothing to hide about that story, but I have hesitation to tell you, because I imagine that some analyst somewhere tells a story about that, which is totally different than reality, totally different than the truth of what actually happened. And each one of you will suffer that as well. You'll be near an accident. You'll be near a sexual assault or a murder. The data retention about you is going to tell that story. And each one of us individually will suffer from that, and we won't have the kind of recourse that we would like, because it isn't going to be a systemic oppression that is direct and obvious. It's not going to be a Stasi guy walking behind you where you can hear his shitty shoes. It's going to be a system that exists as a shadow, your data doppelganger, essentially. So we need to work for a world where there is no data doppelganger, or when there is a data doppelganger, we understand that it is far, far, far from perfect. And to recognize that if we don't have open courts, if we don't have actual transparent processes, if we don't have a liberal democracy, well, we won't have a liberal democracy, obviously. But what we'll have will not be a just world, and won't even have a just process in this world. And you already see that, in fact, in my country. So I know that some of this is just like very repetitive, and a lot of you have heard it before. But what I would say is that there are a couple of responses that I've seen, and I just want to like quash them right now. So the first is that people who are extremely cynical will say to you, yeah, well, you're not surprised, are you? This is half a thought. Encourage anyone that says this to you to finish their thought. Right? If you had a friend who was gay and they were gay bashed by people that don't like homosexuals, you would not, and it would never be appropriate to say, well, you're not surprised, are you? That you got gay bashed by people that don't like homosexuals. Well, what did you think was going to happen in that kind of world? What were you doing there, right? No one reasonably says that to their friend. They say, holy shit, that's fucked up. Let's do something about that. Let's get you to a hospital. Let's take care of these things. Let's find out who did that. Let's stop them from doing it again. So when you see people saying this thought, this, I'm not surprised, encourage them to ask how they feel about it. Encourage them to talk about what they'd like to see. Don't let them only have half a thought if you can. Get them to think the rest of the way through it. The next thing is that people will say, well, the data is out there. There's just nothing that can be done about it. And I like to tell, especially in Germany, the story that I'm a Jewish person of Jewish origin, although I'm an atheist, so everybody hates me, but except in Berlin, to be clear. But thank you, lone clapper. I feel like a Bill Hicks stand-up comedian right now. And here's Bill with the weather. Yeah, so no matter how fucked it is, we can turn it around. Yeah, the data's out there. You're totally right. But what will we do now? Will we continue this problem? No, we can change it. So strong crypto and free software, the head of the Free Software Foundation of Europe, the guy in the purple shirt back there, he would probably love to tell you about free software. When you hear someone say, well, it's already out there, introduce them to the idea of cryptography. Tell them the data doesn't have to be out there without protection, right? When you bear back with the internet, you bear back with Big Brother. Don't do that, right? It's very simple. Don't do that. And so we have an option about that. And the third point is the worst point of all. And I'll leave this as a final parting thought before the Q&A, which is people say that it's for our own good. People will tell us that this is good. It stops real terrorism. But there is an important point to be made, which is about proportionality and about legal oversight and about transparency and about democracy. There are a lot of people that abuse other human beings on the planet. Let's say cops who beat up protesters. We should not censor and surveil the internet because there are so many Scheisebullah on this planet who beat up protesters and then use the internet. We should recognize that the internet is more valuable to all of us. It is open to all of us. And that we, by building a surveillance state, we build the perfect world for turnkey totalitarianism, as Bill Binney would say, which is that when someone else takes control of that infrastructure, they can overthrow a government. They can change the parliamentary debate. They can blackmail people. They can do everything. Because the law is not actually the arbiter of what happens anymore. Not even the arbiter of being right or wrong. It is merely the case that the law creates this fallacy, that there is still some control from the liberal democracy in which we live, or are visiting, perhaps for a long time. And this happened in Greece in 2004, I believe it was, the Athens incident, where someone wiretapped the prime minister and a number of members of parliament, and they never found out who it was. And they did it by doing an attack against telephone switches where there were so-called lawful interception systems installed. And they literally, the one person in charge of that system was found hanged to death in his apartment. So an interesting question is that we change the attack surface of our very societies and we flip it on its head and we don't yet even understand it. So if we wish to not be the arrogant guy from my story about growing up in San Francisco, we need the survival advantage. And that's something that we're really missing right now. And the survival advantage that we must adopt is the one where we recognize that other nations do not respect this nation's laws, and that only mathematics, strong cryptography, combined with real social norms that change unprotected communications to protected ones. Like if you're a lawyer and you want to have, basically a confidential conversation, you need, if you don't want to be considered negligent, you need to have an encrypted cell phone so people can make encrypted calls to you. That won't protect all the metadata that exists, but it's a step forward. And so we can take an incremental approach, and then it is true that there are some really awful people that are caught through surveillance. But the worst offenders of all are at the top of many governments. And those people are the ones that are basically exempt from wiretapping, and they have secure communications. So the question that I would say in return to that person is, how is it that regular people who aren't terrorists will have any privacy at all? How will we accomplish that? With some instrument other than the law. And usually that will set them off in a couple of ways. But one of the ways is that they really won't have an answer if they're really listening, if they're really, really thinking about it. And I would encourage you to engage with these people, because we don't live in a post-privileged society, so we cannot live in a post-privacy society. So I don't want to put too much pressure on you, but I can't really imagine another city anywhere in the world and people other than you that are going to be able to help turn this around in Germany right now, especially in Berlin. So no pressure, but it's up to you.
Thanks, Jake, for prying open the deep state a little bit. And I hope he encouraged at least some of you. And I guess we could do a little Q&A, and we should do a little Q&A. But I'm also thinking of an intercept I read that the Nazis did intercepting the then Czech president Beneš talking to his emissary in London on the evening of World War II. And he said, well, but eat regularly, sleep regularly, and take some fresh air. So maybe we'll limit this to 10 minutes and then hop out and sit next by the river and talk to each other, I'd say.
We have a